The substitute teacher, Ms. Cooper, the first day of school after summer break, always had a peculiar feel to it. You could smell the faint remnants of chalk and the newness of freshly cleaned floors. The air buzzed with the anxious energy of students who hadn't seen each other in months, or perhaps even longer. But for me, that first day back at Briarwood High was more than just a fresh start. It was the beginning of a nightmare I would never escape. I had always been a bit of an outsider, not really fitting in with any particular crowd. As I walked past the large brick building, a wave of dread swept over me, but I pushed it aside. That was just school nerves, right? I wasn't prepared for the horror that awaited me. I noticed a small crowd gathered outside Mr. Dawson's classroom, which was unusual. People were typically more focused on getting to their own homerooms. The whispers and curious glances caught my attention, and like a magnet, I found myself drawn toward the gathering. That's when I saw her. A tall woman stood in the doorway, gazing down at the students in front of her. Her skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and her thin frame seemed fragile. Yet there was something unnervingly commanding about her presence. Her long black dress draped down to the floor, and her stark white hair framed a face that could only be described as gaunt. But what really caught my attention were her eyes. They shimmered. They didn't just reflect the light, they absorbed it, glowing faintly in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. She held a strange aura, one that no one could seem to shake. She was not just a teacher, she was something more.
Good morning, class,
She said, her voice smooth and hypnotic.
I'm Miss Cooper. I'll be your substitute teacher for the foreseeable future. It's good to be home after all these years.
The air felt heavy. The students around me stared at her as though entranced. Their faces softened, almost reverent. But there was something wrong. My stomach churned, and I couldn't shake the sense of unease that twisted deep in my gut. Everyone else was captivated by her, but I felt repelled by her, as though I were the only one who could sense the danger she brought with her. Weeks passed, and I reluctantly began to accept that Miss Cooper was now a permanent fixture in our classroom. Her lessons weren't like those of any normal teacher. They were so captivating, so hypnotic, that it was hard not to fall into a trance as she spoke. Her voice was like velvet, and somehow I found it difficult to keep my eyes off her. It was as though she was drawing us into her web with every word. But the strange behavior started creeping in around the school. First, it was Matt, the class clown. He had always been loud, obnoxious, cracking jokes and trying to get attention. Suddenly, he became silent, withdrawn. I caught him at his desk one afternoon, scribbling furiously in a notebook. I leaned over, asking what he was working on.
It's important, Ashley. You wouldn't understand.
He muttered, not lifting his gaze from the paper. That was the last time I heard him speak to me. Then there was Jessica. She used to be sharp, defiant, questioning every rule. But now, she was eerily compliant. She would nod along to everything Miss Cooper said, her eyes wide, glowing with adoration.
You just don't get it, Ash.
She would say with a weird smile.
But you will soon.
It didn't take long for more and more students to fall under her spell. They started changing, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The once vibrant, lively people I had known were becoming hollow, like they were nothing more than puppets. But I wasn't affected, or at least I didn't think I was. At first, it was subtle. Simple disagreements turned into full-blown fights. Sam, the quiet kid, tried to argue with Miss Cooper one afternoon about an assignment. That was a mistake. Within seconds, a group of my classmates, once normal, kind people, pounced on him. Their faces contorted with rage, fists flying. It wasn't just a fight, it was an attack, a savage act of violence. And Ms. Cooper, She just stood in the doorway, her lips curled in a faint smile, watching it all unfold with cold satisfaction. It was as if she was orchestrating it, feeding off the violence, the chaos, the fear. When the principal was called to investigate, he barely reacted. The students involved in the fight were given detention, but nothing more. It was like they were all under her control. As I watched the transformation, I started to notice something far worse than just the odd behavior. The changes weren't just in their attitudes, they were in their physical appearance too. My classmates began to look wrong. I saw Angela in the bathroom one day. Her fingernails had grown impossibly long, curling like claws, and her eyes were no longer the bright blue they used to be. They were bulging, stretched wide, as though they were too big for her face. When she saw me staring at her in the mirror, she smiled. A sick, twisted smile.
"Why are you staring, Ashley?"
She asked, her voice too sweet, too syrupy. She began scratching at her face with her sharp nails, blood streaking down her cheeks. I ran out of the bathroom, heart hammering in my chest. I felt like I was losing my mind. A week later, students started to disappear. It was always the same. Ms. Cooper would ask,
Who's ready for an exciting project after school?
and everyone would raise their hand, eager to volunteer. But it wasn't the usual after-school homework assignment. No, she'd select a student, and they'd never be seen again. The first to go was Matt. I remember seeing him excitedly raise his hand, and Miss Cooper picked him. That was the last time I saw him. No one questioned it. No one seemed to care. And it happened again the next week, and the next. More students vanished, and it seemed like the entire school had forgotten about them. No one called the police, no one went to their houses asking questions. It was as though they had simply never existed. I was the only one who cared, the only one who noticed, determined to find out what had happened to my classmates. I spent nights at the school library, digging through old records and yearbooks. Miss Cooper had said she was home after all these years. That meant she had been a part of this school before. I dug deeper. Finally, I found it. Her face, staring back at me from the 1986 yearbook. She hadn't aged a day. Her name wasn't Miss Cooper. It was Pamela. My heart stopped. I tore the page from the yearbook and shoved it into my bag. But as I turned to leave, I froze. The door behind me creaked open.
What are you doing, Ashley?
Miss Cooper's voice rang out, cold and mocking. I spun around, and there she was, standing in the doorway. Her smile was wide, but there was nothing kind about it.
Curiosity can be dangerous.
She whispered. Her eyes gleamed with something dark and ancient. Without thinking, I bolted from the room. I didn't dare look back. I knew I couldn't handle this alone. So, I went to my Uncle Henry, a police officer, and showed him the evidence I had uncovered. He ran a background check on her. That's when he learned that Pamela Cooper had gone missing in 1986. She had disappeared during a hike in the Appalachian Mountains and was presumed dead. Uncle Henry promised to investigate further. The next day, he showed up at the school with another officer. They confronted Mr. Cooper in the hallway. I watched from a distance as the conversation escalated. Suddenly, everything went wrong. My uncle drew his gun and shot his colleague in the face. The sound of the shot echoed through the hallway. The officer's body crumpled to the ground, lifeless. My uncle's face was blank, like he was under some sort of spell. He turned toward me, the gun still in his hand. "Uncle Henry," I whispered, but his gaze was vacant. He grabbed my wrist and dragged me to where Miss Cooper stood. The students gathered around, their eyes vacant, waiting for her command. The stench of decay hit me like a wave. Miss Cooper smiled at me, her lips curling into a sinister grin.
You don't have to fight this, Ashley.
She whispered, her voice cold.
Everyone else is so happy. Why can't you be happy too?
In that moment, I felt it. My grandmother's amulet, hidden beneath my shirt, pressed against my skin. It was a talisman passed down through generations, a protective charm. I had never believed in its power until now. I grasped it tightly, feeling its warmth. Suddenly, Ms. Cooper flinched, her expression faltering for the first time. She staggered back, and I saw fear in her eyes, true fear. She screamed, her voice cracking with panic. Her body convulsed as black tendrils of smoke began to pour from her skin, twisting and writhing like serpents. Her body jerked and twisted in ways that defied nature. Then, with one final deafening scream, she crumpled to the floor, her once ghostly form decaying before my eyes. The students around us blinked, as though waking from a dream. They looked confused, frightened, as if they had no idea what had just happened. Uncle Henry dropped to his knees, sobbing beside the body of his colleague, realizing the horror he had been forced to participate in. In the days that followed, the police uncovered a terrible truth. They found the bodies of the missing students in Miss Cooper's backyard, buried beneath freshly dug soil. The story made headlines in our small town, but the horror of what had happened could never fully be captured by words. I still lie awake at night, heart racing, expecting to see her standing in the corner of my room,